So first of all, thank you for inviting me here and taking interest in this research and giving me an opportunity to talk to you about it. And I will fully credit, I've stolen the picture of shape of learning that you put there on from LinkedIn. I kind of like it. It also motivated me for the first time to actually go and play with Midjourney, and I lost several hours of productive work as a result, but produced some really cool pictures I can share with you later. The title's a bit of a cheeky one, and really it's about two separate mathematical techniques that we've been working on. One is applying techniques around quantifying, measuring, and putting values to shape, like shapes of points, of clouds of points. And the other is around my current favorite kind of machine learning technique, which is called reservoir computing, which I'll talk more about later on. So let me start by showing you what I think of as shape. So this is my take on what's on that slide there. This is typically we're interested in dynamical systems. So in machine learning statistical language, that is a time series of measurements, and we're trying to predict what happens next in that time series. We have a belief that the time series comes from some deterministic system, so we can write down some equations and use them to predict the next state, except we don't know those equations. And that's where the machine learning comes in. It's a way of building a model which mimics those equations and helps us predict the future. And so there's a whole host of questions around what sort of machine learning is good at doing that job, and also how do you know if you've done a good job, and what is it you're trying to do anyway, really. This is a picture. I like it because it's got a lot of shape to it. If anyone's familiar with the field of chaos theory, this is actually the Lorenz system. Right? If you've seen that before, it's a very famous butterfly attractor. It's got two wings. It looks nothing like this. But what I've done is taken that data and represented it in a different space. Each of the points here represents a state of my system. So I'm predicting the future from one state to the next state to the next state. And the connections that I'm trying to make here are between states which are similar. So in machine learning parlance, you make predictions by taking your data in and trying to find things that are similar to it and seeing what happens to them. Right? That's kind of the basic tenet of almost all of machine learning. What's similar? Here's my observation. What's similar to it that I've seen before? What's my learning from before? And how can I predict forward? So this is looking at similar states in this system. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I just put it up there because it's pretty. I'm going to be talking about these two techniques, reservoir computing, which is kind of an old hat method in machine learning, which physicists have rediscovered, mathematicians have rediscovered, and we like it because of the way in which it takes in data and represents that data internally within the machine as a state of that machine. And I'll talk about how that works. The second thing, persistent homology, that's the technology that we're using to understand shape. So, first of all, reservoir computing, and this is my first attempt at Midjourney. This is a bucket of water, but what's coming out of it is a whole bunch of neurons connected and wired together. So that's a success, right? And the reason it's called reservoir computing is because originally there were experiments done where they literally had a bucket of water, right? And digital camera mounted above that bucket of water, taking images of the ripple pattern on that water, and they'd have a probe in the water generating ripple patterns. And the digital camera measuring those little ripple patterns at certain points, using those patterns, the heights of the waves at different points in the bucket, to make predictions about what the system does next. Right? And the reason it works, well, there's two reasons it works. One is the bucket of water is just generating new patterns. And that's kind of what machine learning is about. Take your data and generate different patterns from it, different representations. And the other reason it worked was behind the scenes, there's a whole lot of regularization going on. So you're not using all of the image, you're using the right parts of that image. So it's just, in a sense, in a rather abstract sense, just like feeding a deep neural network with a signal, it's got millions of neurons, each of them's generating a different pattern, and some of them happen to work, and those are the ones that you choose as your output. The idea behind it can be represented. There might be a couple of equations, but not too many. On the left, there's some input state, which here it's a vector, but it could be just a single input going in. That feeds into your network, to your reservoir. There's some activation function on each of these, and it's connected to the inputs, to other things, and also to the output. The output, you've got a bunch of different things that you see on the output layer, and that's where the fitting goes on. So the magic with a reservoir computer model is there's no fitting here. There's tricks and techniques we use, and this is the first place that shape comes into things, of choosing a nice network, but the network is random. It's random but constrained. So what I mean by that is it's random, but the entire network has got certain types of structure to it. Right? So you'll see from the picture here, it's recurrent. There's loops in here. So previous states echo through the system. That's important mathematically. And there's enough connectivity to generate enough different patterns here. But the fitting only occurs at the output layer. We're just putting parameters on those out. So the lambdas, the output weights, well here it's called R, they just go on top of the different outputs. We choose amongst, probably not 4, but very many outputs, the ones that here we've got 4 outputs and we're fitting them to different elements of this with different combinations of weights. Okay? But the idea is simply apply your favorite regularization, ridge regression or whatever at the output layer to choose the weights that you like. Okay? That's it. The good thing about this is that, and since you're talking about AI hardware, you can actually build one of these. Not electronically, well you can do it electronically as well, but this is, not digitally. This is actually an analog implementation of that idea. So for reasons which I won't go into unless anyone asks me, rather than a fully random deep network which is complicated to implement in hardware, we have a loop of nodes which, because we have interesting ways of reading out and connecting them, has the same effect, it has the same memory, and that's implemented in hardware from an input to produce an output, and we can then fit the output. Right? This is a proof in principle. I'm not selling these. I don't recommend anyone use this particular one, but the underlying idea, this is on the benchtop of my lab at UWA, the underlying idea here though is that because you can implement it in hardware, you can actually make these things work really fast. There's groups in Europe that are doing this with optical networks, so they're doing it at optical frequencies. And they're also in Mallorca, which is a nice place to visit if you happen to want to do research into these things. So reservoir computers are nice. They are a simple, mathematically simple way of building a machine learning model. But what can we do with them? So one of my passion projects is, with a lot of machine learning, you don't really understand what's going on inside the black box. Right? That's why it's a black box. You feed stuff in, you get stuff out, you hope it works. And part of the strength of this method is that, okay, in some ways it's a complex system that has this emergent behavior that we can't fully understand the reason why, but we can understand what's going on about it, okay? And so one of the things that reservoir computers do is they have this recurrent property. They remember their past states. Mathematically, this means that if we feed in a time series, so feed in a series of observations, then it remembers the previous observations. And that means that when it comes time to build a model, you're building a model not just of the current state, but of the previous states that were in there before. And mathematically, that means that we can do what's known in dynamical systems as an embedding. And that means that no matter what dimension the system that we're trying to model is, so you might be modeling human heartbeats. It's not a one-dimensional system, but you measure a one-dimensional time series, a one-dimensional model is not going to cut it. But because you're remembering previous states, the machine actually has the higher dimensional model inside. And so what I'm showing here is if we have a series of measurements from such a system and we want to quantify some property of it. The property I'm quantifying here is something called Lyapunov exponent. It doesn't matter what it is, it's a measure of how chaotic the system is, but it's just a number. It's a number that measures some property of the system. And there's algorithms to estimate this property. They're complicated, but there's algorithms to do that. We've got a dial we can turn up and down on the system to generate different time series that have different values of that parameter. So I've got my input system, I can make it more chaotic, less chaotic, and I've got this complicated thing I can measure as to how chaotic it is. What I'm doing now is I feed that signal into the reservoir computer and ask the reservoir computer from its internal state to tell me what that Lyapunov exponent is. And that's what you see in the yellow line here. So it's not fitting this number to this number, but it's just the internal state of that system actually encapsulates in it the same information as that measure of chaoticness. Right, so inside the system, there's something going on in the representation within the reservoir, so that the values of the nodes in that reservoir, and there's thousands of them, when read out in the correct way, give me an estimate of the Lyapunov exponent. So that tells me that the reservoir isn't just, and this is not unique to reservoirs, I'm using them because I like them, other deep learning techniques have the same thing, but I'm a simple-minded mathematician, so I tend to stay away from things like PyTorch and scikit-learn and stuff like that, which I don't know what's going on with every little bit of it. This is something I can write down in 5 or 6 lines of Python code. I can write, well, give me time. But 5 or 6 lines of Python code is all you need to implement a reservoir computer from scratch. Right? So that's why I'm using that particular model. But what it tells me is internal to the system is activity that, when looked at in the right way, looking at the right shape of that activity, tells me what the Lyapunov exponent is, what the measure of the overall structure of the system is. And that's really useful. It's not useful just for prediction, but it's useful for describing how the system is behaving, in a sort of global sense rather than just a predictive sense. This is an example of doing this in a maintenance setting. So this is some work that we did with the ARC Industrial Transformation Training Center for Transforming Maintenance with Data Science. Blamed that on a federal government minister, that's where the name came from. Essentially, data science for predictive maintenance. This is an industrial pump. We're measuring vibration and different axes in this pump, feeding that into the reservoir computer, just as I was doing with this toy model with this logistic map and Lyapunov exponents and stuff. So instead of taking this chaotic system, I'm taking this pump, and instead of trying to estimate Lyapunov exponent, the property I'm trying to estimate is, well, to be honest, I've forgotten exactly what it's called, but if are there any pump mechanical engineers in the room? It's something to do with the cavitation of the pump. Right? Some measure they can take, provided they can get inside the pump to the water flow, and it's a measure of the cavitation properties of that pump. So to measure it, they need to go and look at the flow of water. We're looking at the vibration from the outside. And from that, we're getting our predictions, the yellow crosses, from just looking at the state of the reservoir of this property. The identity line is perfect prediction. Depending on where you're coming from, you're either going to say, well, that's pretty rubbish, actually, or if you're a maintenance engineer looking at mechanical pumps, you're really quite happy with that because the crosses go up, right? Increasing cavitation is predicted from increasing activation of this activity in the network. So it's not simply fitting the machine learning model to a predictive task given this input, this is the output. It's not that. We're looking at a summary statistic of the behavior of the system, the internal network nodes, and that gives us this measure of cavitation. So that's really useful for them because they can now get, if we tweak it a little bit, at least a reasonably good estimate of what the cavitation properties of that pump are. The different axes here, this is taken from a paper we wrote a couple of years ago, but the different axes are just different representations of the data going into the system. So different transformations and different tweaks on the system. So some are better than others. But the point is, it's not just mathematical curiosity. We can get something useful by looking at the internal state of the machine in a reasonably complicated system. Okay, so what's that got to do with shape? Obviously, I've got no one's moving enough to keep the lights on in the room. We mean shape in many different ways, and we're looking at shape in many ways, some of which I'm not going to get to in this talk. One of the things that I'm not going to get to in this talk, which was the paper that you were talking about, is understanding how the dynamical behavior of these systems, these networks, changes when you drive them in different ways, and understanding which configurations give, in general, good performance. Right? So it turns out that's kind of a dry and complicated problem, and I want to show you pretty pictures instead. So I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about instead is how do we, well, I've shown you about how the internal state of the reservoir, the shape of the activation. So you think of the reservoir as a collection of nodes and their activations as their heights. So that gives you this configuration of things. Some are high, some are low. How does that tell you something about the likelihood of exponent or cavitation of a pump? Excuse me. The other two key problems we're going to talk about is the shape of the input and the shape of the output. Right, so how does the shape of the input, how do we quantify that? How does that affect performance? And, excuse me again, how do we understand the shape of the output, and how does the shape of that output compare to what we wanted to get in the first place? So one of the challenges that we have when trying to build models to predict behavior of dynamical systems, thank you very much. One of the problems we have when trying to build models of dynamical systems is we don't really have a good measure of what a good model is. Right? The usual way of deciding whether a model is good or not is what? Prediction error. Right? Lower prediction error is better. Prediction error tells you about how well you predict the next state. Predicting the next state doesn't necessarily give you a good simulation of the behavior. Right? If I wanted to predict the high temperature 2 weeks from now, that was my model. You come up with a model which would give you something like a mean. That's not a very good prediction of dynamics. So you're just going to say, well, the average temperature in November is, I don't know, 32 degrees, so I predict it'll be 32 degrees next Tuesday. On average, that works well, but it doesn't represent the dynamics, the way the system changes over time. So what we're trying to get at is a measure of how well the behavior of the model matches the behavior of the system we're trying to model. Okay, so let me show you how that works. And this brings me to my second Mid-Journey figure. This one I really like. Mid-Journey hit this one out of the park in more ways than one. What you see here is a bunch of points, so a cloud of points. And what I'm trying to do is quantify the shape of that cloud of points. And the way in which persistent homology does this, which I'll show you in a moment, is by building a network. That's the connections you see here. Right? So you connect nodes that are close together to give you this network. That network has fully connected subgraphs. It's a simplicial complex. Some parts of it are quite dense with lots of connections, some parts are more sparse. But what we're interested in are the holes in this shape. Where are those places where there's not data? And Mathematically, when you build a graph from nodes, you connect them together. And I apologise already, the number of times I've used the word mathematically. Someone throws something at me every time I use it again. Not you. We build a graph, nodes connecting each other together, we get a simplicial complex. These are like shapes within that graph. The dense parts are the ones that are tetrahedrons and high dimensional versions of that. And the ones that are sparse are where you have these rings that don't have anything connecting them together in the middle. Right? There's no direct connections. So Midjourney's really nailed that one. Let me show you how we actually do this. Well, okay, before I do, this one's a failure. So persistent homology is something from the field of topology. And how many of you have heard the topologist's joke, right? What's the difference between a coffee cup and a donut? Well, nothing. They've both got one hole. Right? Topologists care about the number of holes things have. Midjourney's kind of screwed it up because, although it's nice and dark so you can't see it, the coffee cup hole is here and the donut hole is here, so it's kind of stuffed it up because this wouldn't work as a coffee cup because you pour the coffee and it'd fall out the bottom. Right? But you imagine a coffee cup, it's got one connected hole component, and you could morph that without tearing it, breaking it, folding it into a donut. Right? And that's what I've asked Midjourney to do. So that's the basic kind of mathematical toolkit that we're working with. And how do we go about doing all that? Okay, there's a lot going on in this picture, but this is important because this is kind of this is what I want you to, this gets to the heart of what Sean was talking about in terms of how what we're doing might be useful. And so this is the key piece of technology that we're using. You start with your cloud of points. Right? Here it's just a circle because that's simple to illustrate, but cloud of points in n dimensions, doesn't matter, you can do whatever you want. Around each of those points, we draw a circle. And from left to right, we make those circles get bigger and bigger and bigger. When the circles touch, we connect the dots. So the circle radius is this number here. So increasing circle radius on both axes. For very small circle radius, nothing's connected. We've got discrete dots. When the circle radius gets big enough, these two get connected, and this connected subgraph of size 2 is created. Right? The circles get bigger still, and now every one of those dots is connected to its components, so I've got a connected ring. I make the circles bigger still, and eventually each of those dots is connected to every other dot. Right? And that's when I've got a complete simplex. A fully connected subgraph, every node connected to every other node. And what we say is this ring that is created here is destroyed here. All right? What we're measuring here with these beta 0, beta 1 doesn't matter too much for today, but these are called Betty numbers, and they measure the subgraphs of different dimension. Right, so here, this is telling you that you've got 7 discrete components. Here you've got now 6 discrete components. Here you've got 1 discrete component, but there's a hole in the middle. And here you've got 1 discrete component, but no holes in the middle. That's roughly what the Betty 0, Betty 1 means. Not exactly, but near enough. But what we're going to plot is when these connected components get created and when they die. So here, just ignore the yellow ones. These are for different size homologies. Just look at the blue dots. And each of them is plotted in 2D here. So 2D point, 2 values. Those 2 values are the time it's created and the time it's destroyed. Right, so here it's been plotted as a point on 2D, but you could think of it as a line segment. This thing existed from epsilon at size 0.05 up to 0.2. And you can do the same thing. Turns out there's lots of these things being created and being destroyed. And we plot this like in this way, or we plot it. This is a representation of this plot rotated through 45 degrees and summed up in a clever way. There's a third way of representing it as a series of line segments, which I think, yeah, is what I've got here. A series of line segments showing things when things created and when things die. But I'm measuring, as these circles get bigger and bigger and bigger, when things connect and when those things cease to be a separate component because a bigger component is being created. Right, so the point here is I've gone from 6 components to 1 component. Right, so those 6 components, or indeed there'll be more before I get to there, they're destroyed and replaced with 1 big component. Okay? But I'm measuring those creation time, birth times and death times of those components. And the neat thing about this is it tells me about the whole. So it tells me about the handle of the coffee cup. So these numbers give me a way of quantifying the structure. So this is a very long way of getting through topology with no equations, but it's a very long way of saying I'm able to measure how connected these clouds of points are. And I can plot it like this. I can rotate it through 45 degrees and sum it up and plot it like this. Or I can plot it as a series of bars. Birth times and death times on the axis here. Now, this is a really interesting paper by the group of Danielle Bassett in the US a couple of years ago now, but they applied the same toolkit, persistent homology toolkit, to look at language learning in toddlers. And what they looked at was, over time, how many words toddlers knew, how they learned those words, and linguistically how those words were connected. And from all of that, they were able to show that the language, irrespective of the socioeconomic background of the toddlers, the language at home of the toddlers, they learned words in a way which didn't grow, like build a word and connected words to it. It had holes in the way they learned language. So the toddlers are learning words from the set of their parents and then backfilling the words that they're missing. Okay. So I put that up here just because it's an interesting application of the idea. There's heaps of places where people have applied this persistent homology idea, and so there's 2 related fields. Persistent homology is the one that comes from mathematics. Computer scientists have taken it and applied it, and data scientists, and call it topological data analysis. They're slightly different, but you may have heard of one or the other of them, or you would look for one or the other of them. Okay, but back to my problem. So this is a time series. Just ignore the yellow line for the time being. Just look at the white line. And this is this thing that I want to predict. I want to predict what's happening next in this system. So I'm a mathematician. It's a toy system. It happens to be the Lorenz system. It's the same butterfly attractor that I showed you before. But again, that doesn't matter. I'm just looking at a time series trying to predict the future behavior. But I don't want to just predict the next value. I want to get a machine that, when I let it run by itself, produces something that looks like the same system. So on the top is an example of a success, because the yellow one, starting from the same initial conditions, okay, it's giving you completely different values. But there's good reasons for that. It's chaotic. It's not going to produce the same thing every time from slightly different initial conditions. If anyone's old enough to remember the first Jurassic Park, that was the whole premise of Jeff Goldblum's character, right? Different initial conditions, different outcome. This one is a bad model because eventually it does something that's quite different from the Lorenz system. This one doesn't do that. And it's not just I've chosen different runs. This one genuinely doesn't have this behavior. This behavior exists because there's a stable fixed point in the system, which this one doesn't have. So I want a way of algorithmically looking at these things and saying, hey, top one's good, bottom one's bad. Top one's good because it looks like the data. It doesn't look like the data in terms of correlation. They're completely different. It doesn't look like the data in terms of root mean square error. They differ eventually. It does look like the data qualitatively, and that's what I care about. And that's where the shape comes in. So I will skip a few steps, but essentially, and that's an awful colour scheme for this projector. I apologise, but there's actually, well, some of them, you can see some of them. There's actually 2 sets of dots here, and I hope most of you can see them. There's a pink set and a blue set. I'll confess, the figure came from the paper that we published in 2021. The paper had a white background. I just reversed the colour map to get the black background, which I think looks cooler. But turns out that blue and pink, or blue and peach, aren't the greatest colours for contrast. But you can see here, for example, that the blue one is doing something quite different from the peach coloured one. Right? Here, it's doing something quite different again. Now, but even though it's different, it's in the same area. Right? So if you're measuring distance between points, it's kind of in the right place, but it's just, its behaviour is quite different. And what does that mean? It means this thing's got holes and gaps in it where the peach one doesn't. Whereas these ones, well, these two anyway are much better. This one's moderately okay. Right? My evidence for these two being better is that you can't see the difference between the peach dots and the blue dots. But if you've got really good colour differentiation, they are different, but they're the same in the same space. So when I apply those persistent homology ideas to these and get that measure of those 2 sets of points, I can measure how far apart they are, and I can say, hey, this one's the winner because those points are close together. These ones not so much, because even though it's behaving in a similar fashion, it's not quite the same thing. And incidentally, what's happening here is the blue one is periodic, but it's also got quite a long period, and it's also a little noisy. So it's periodicity, but even from the time series, it's kind of hard to detect that periodicity because it's not just a single cycle over one pseudo-orbit. Okay, so we did the same sort of thing. So this is using that persistent homology idea to grade the shape of what's coming out of my model. On the other side, I can try and use the same techniques to be selective on what goes into the model. Right, so what inputs I'm going to select from my neural network. And this is independent of the reservoir or any other techniques. I've got a time series, I've got a high dimensional system, and I want to have a multi-dimensional input to that system. And I want to do that in a way which is fully informative to the machine learning model, for the algorithm, but also not got lots of redundant information. So I want to pick a small set of observations from now and previous times in the past that best capture everything that's going on. I could feed it everything and hope that the algorithm sorts itself out. And if your computer's big enough, you've got the funding of Google, and you've got long enough, that'll work most of the time, probably. But what I want to do is choose those inputs in some more systematic way that gives me information about what's doing good, what's working well, and it tells me something physically about what's going on in that system. And I'm going to apply the same idea of the shape of the data to the input data, to the data coming into the system. And what I'm showing you here is the different shaped data sets I get in 2 dimensions, each of these in 2 dimensions, but finally in 3 dimensions, when I input 3 different past values. And which one of these, so this is the 3 separate pairs of inputs from one algorithm, 3 separate pairs of input for another algorithm, and 3 separate pairs of input for a third algorithm. Which one's best, do you reckon? 1, 2, or 3?
3.
3. Anyone disagree? Well, it's different from the other 2, right? But it's 3 because what 3 has done is it's captured things on a different timescale. Most of the time that timescale is redundant, and that's a straight line down the diagonal here. But some of the time it's not redundant, and what this is doing is stuff that none of these other ones do. And it turns out that when I feed these inputs into my model, I get, well, this is the true data, I get something which is better, not perfect, but better than the competing schemes. It's better able to capture these different time scales. Just for the record, this is, if anyone's interested, this is an experiment with a lobster neuron. For some reason, there seems to be a strong tradition in dynamics and dynamical systems for studying neuronal systems from animals that taste good. Lobsters, the other classic data set that we have is from squid axons. But yeah, so apparently the lobster's got a nice, big, easy to access neuron, and you can barbecue what's left over. But what we're interested in is how well our model, our machine learning model, can capture this slow, fast, slow behavior. And also look at the fast behavior. It's not fast with a single frequency, it's fast but slowing down. That's really complicated to try to model. This one's not perfect. This is our best guess based on trying to extract everything you can from the shape of the model. But it's better than these other attempts. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so I'm just about finished. I just want to give you one more example. This is stuff that is only just been accepted for publication, just in case anyone's in doubt of this being useful apart from providing food for the Sunday afternoon barbecue. This is data from humans, hearts. Each of these is a different data set, different person. This is the training data that we use to build the model. The crosses are when a cardiologist says the person is having a heart attack. So they've gone and looked at it, and they said, that's when it starts. The blue dots are when our algorithm, based on looking at how the shape changes, when our algorithm detects onset of the heart attack. So, yeah, it's not perfect. And we'd like to hope that these precursors don't occur in any of us who aren't having heart attacks, because that would be kind of a fault in the system. But we pretty much start to detect these things when the real heart attacks start. Right? So just looking at how the shape of the system changes. Now, there's a lot going on under the hood here, and just to show you, this is what the normal heartbeat looks like, at least, well, it's not that normal actually. I mean, most of you got Apple Watches or something nowadays, and hopefully your regular ECG doesn't look quite like that, but that's the normal part, and that's fibrillation. But what we're interested in detecting is when this one starts to behave like that. Right? So this is a hard example with a very strict change, but often it's not so sudden. You get intermittent missing of beats and other precursors that are predictive of the onset of the heart attack. And this algorithm, looking at the shape of the data, is giving us that. And I think that's where I'll stop. Special prize for me to figure out what I was trying to do with Midjourney there. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll answer any questions.